Have you ever stopped to think that the greatest cathedrals of Europe might not have been built by the people shown in our textbooks? What if everything we're told about the construction of these grand buildings isn't true? Imagine that these cathedrals weren't built from scratch, but are actually the remains of a long-vanished civilization whose knowledge has been hidden from us. You might be surprised, but historical data, engineering calculations, and architectural mysteries can shatter everything we thought we knew about the past. The myths about how ordinary people in the 13th century built these giant stone wonders are starting to crack. Mysterious fires that erased old churches, logistical inconsistencies, all of this could be a carefully concealed link in a chain of evidence pointing to a global catastrophe that destroyed ancient technologies. What if these cathedrals aren't just masterpieces of the past, but silent witnesses to a lost civilization? And if that's really the case, how could the truth ever be told? These buildings might hide a much darker history than you think. What if I told you that the greatest cathedrals of Europe weren't built by people, but by ghosts? Too strange to believe? Think about it. We're used to the official history where everything makes sense. Architects, builders, techniques. What could be simpler? But imagine this seemingly standard scenario hides something far more mysterious. Take the Reims Cathedral in France, for example. One of the greatest structures, a symbol of Gothic architecture that has stood for centuries. What do we know about it? We're told construction began in 1211, and it was completed just 80 years later. Incredible, right? Especially when you consider that back then, there were no trucks, no cranes, no power tools. Yet, despite the lack of all that, the cathedral, with its grand stone vaults and incredibly complex facades, was built in such a short span, 80 years. The question is, how is that possible? We're told it was a feat of human genius, that it was all done by the hands of people at that time. But if you could transport yourself back to those years, you'd see a very different picture. It was a world without electricity, without cranes, without computers to calculate architectural plans. A world where the only tools were hammers, chisels, and the strength of horses. Could you build such a masterpiece without all the power we have today? The math and the logic just don't add up with the official version. And what if there's something more behind this than we're being told? What if the cathedrals of Europe aren't just the legacy of medieval builders, but the traces of a long-gone civilization whose technology was lost? The answer to this question isn't obvious. We need to look at this mysterious phenomenon through the lens of numbers and logic to understand why Reims Cathedral and others like it couldn't just be products of their time. Let's go back to Reims Cathedral and try to figure out how it was built. When you look at this incredible building, your imagination is captured by its scale and grandeur. Stone vaults reaching for the sky, thousands of sculptures, each one a separate work of art. This cathedral just overwhelms you with its majesty. But if you look closer, a question appears. How could people living back then create something so perfect? Doing this without modern technology, without cranes and computers for calculations, is incredibly difficult. It seems like none of it would have been possible unless there was some secret involved. The official version, of course, offers a simple explanation. They say people back then were exceptionally skilled craftsmen who could work with stone and math like no one else. But that, you have to admit, looks a bit strange. Why was everything else in science and technology back then so much more primitive? Yet architecture and construction show such perfection. To build a cathedral like this, you wouldn't just need human strength and talent. You'd need knowledge that, in theory, should have been lost during those dark ages. Technology that we can't even replicate today. But what if that technology wasn't actually developed by the people of that time? What if it was found, including in this very cathedral? To understand how this is possible, let's look at the details. Complex engineering calculations, mathematical precision in fitting stones and building vaults. All of this requires knowledge that was far ahead of its time. But instead of admitting that these buildings could have been created by more advanced civilizations, we keep believing these masterpieces are the result of human genius. Maybe it's time to look at history from a different angle and question the truth we've been fed. It's from this point that our investigation enters a new phase. We need to understand that cathedrals and castles aren't just unique achievements of past builders. They might be the traces of a much older and more advanced civilization whose contribution to history was hidden and forgotten. When you start talking about building giant structures like Reims Cathedral, a ton of questions come up. The stone blocks used to build it weighed several tons, and they didn't just need to be quarried, but shaped with a precision that was beyond most people in the 13th century. But most importantly, how were these massive blocks transported to the construction site? Without cranes, trucks, or railways, which we see as essential for logistics, moving materials this heavy becomes impossible. We're told builders used primitive tools and methods. But how can that be true if you think about the effort it would take to move such huge stones to the site, especially without the help of modern machinery? Where were the quarries the stone came from? How was it shaped without the machine tools and blueprints we use today? If this process were real, we'd have to find information about how the builders organized the logistics for such huge projects. But we don't see any mention of these routes. Where were the massive transport chains that would allow stones to be moved over such distances? Where were the workers housed at the construction sites? How were they supplied and supported? We don't find anything that confirms the official version of how this was possible. All these questions make you think. Maybe these cathedrals weren't built from scratch, but were found and restored later. We can be sure that such projects would have required more advanced technology and organization than what existed in the 13th century. When we start to look more closely at the mystery of these structures, we find another strange pattern. Almost every great stone cathedral or castle in Europe is linked to the same story, a story of a fire. For almost every one of these buildings, there's a legend that they were built on the site of an older wooden church or temple that burned to the ground. Reims Cathedral is no exception. We're told construction of this majestic building began right after the previous wooden church was destroyed by fire. But why do all these buildings have such a similar backstory? This story of fires, which seems way too convenient for historians, gets repeated from one cathedral to the next. The mystery is that almost all of these stone giants begin their existence after a flame destroys their simpler predecessors. It looks like a carefully planned explanation that fills in the gaps in the historical timeline. Why would an important stone building, meant to last for centuries, need such a fiery prehistory? This pattern solves a few problems at once. First, it explains why they suddenly started building such grand structures on that spot. Second, it creates an illusion of continuity, linking the new buildings to older, supposedly primitive ones. But when you look at it mathematically, it becomes clear that this repeating coincidence points to something much bigger. These fires, apparently, weren't accidents, but part of some larger global process. This isn't just a logical inconsistency, It's a real mystery that might hide a much older and more destructive catastrophe. And if we pay attention to these stories, it becomes obvious that fire isn't just a natural disaster, but possibly a key to understanding what happened during those dark ages. The construction of cathedrals, which couldn't have been built under normal conditions, might not have been a result of natural development, but part of a recovery after a disaster. We see this same pattern all over Europe: fire, destruction, and then, strangely enough, the rapid construction of new grand buildings. When we start looking into the architects of these grand cathedrals, the situation gets even more mysterious. The official version says Reims Cathedral was designed by an architect named Jean. But as soon as we try to learn more about him, strange things appear. We don't find a clear biography. His life is shrouded in darkness, and even though his name is attached to such great projects, his actual existence seems doubtful. Where are his drawings, his studies, his projects? Where are his students or colleagues? We only find vague mentions and guesses. His biography seems more like a myth than a real history. Jean is credited with projects built back in the 6th century, and then, 600 years later, he supposedly starts designing churches. This time gap creates a strange picture of a man who seems to travel through time. We start to wonder, was he really the architect of Reims Cathedral? Was he just someone whose name was later attached as the great builder to explain these architectural marvels? Maybe his name was just added to the story to give an explanation for something no one could understand. These kinds of mythical architects show up in many stories about great buildings. Their work is impressive, but they leave no traces of their lives. This is another element that makes us doubt the official version. Who really built these cathedrals? Maybe their builders weren't the people we're told about. Continuing the investigation, we run into another important detail. The historical timeline we base our understanding on seems shaky. If cathedrals like Reims were built in the 13th century, then who was their creator, when calculations show the world's population back then was tiny? Historians often say there were only about 18,000 people on the planet in the year 1200. That's basically the population of one small town. How could you build such massive structures under those conditions? We're told cathedrals were built by ordinary people, but if there were so few of them, how could they work on projects of this scale? How could such labor-intensive processes like quarrying, shaping, and transporting stone be organized? Building just one cathedral would have required incredible effort and resources that simply didn't exist back then. The math behind the population numbers just shatters the official version. If the population was that small, how do you explain it? History doesn't give us clear answers. All we're offered are abstract dates and facts that seem convincing at first glance. But if you dig deeper, you realize none of it matches what we know about the logistics and scale of such projects. Mathematical calculations show that building cathedrals at that time was simply impossible. This means that maybe these buildings weren't built by 13th century people at all. Instead, they found them or restored them, using structures that were already there. History, perhaps, hides a much older and more mysterious past. As we dig deeper into history and the math, it becomes obvious the official version doesn't hold up. Let's look at the population numbers again. Throughout the Middle Ages, the world's population was extremely small. In the year 1200, according to official sources, there were only about 18,000 people on the entire planet. How, under those conditions, could cathedrals like Rheims be built? How many people would it take to build just one such building? And where were they all? Building these objects requires huge effort. Thousands of workers, quarries for the stone, transporting and shaping materials, organizing supplies and housing. But we don't find any evidence of the infrastructure that could support such work. Where were these quarries? How were these heavy stone blocks moved if there were no railways, cranes, or modern vehicles back then? We understand that building cathedrals on this scale would have been impossible for the population that existed at that time. Mathematically, it's impossible. Every step we take in our investigation leads to the same conclusion. These buildings could not have been built by people in the 13th century. But then, who were their creators? This again points us to the idea that these buildings were built much earlier, before the world's population became as small as we're told. What if these cathedrals aren't the result of the labor of people from that time, but the legacy of a long-vanished civilization that used technology we can't access now? Maybe the cathedrals we see aren't creations of the 13th century, but a rebirth or restoration of buildings left by a more advanced civilization. So what was really happening back then? Why do we find these contradictions in official history and basic math? The answer to this might lie in another aspect: a global catastrophe that could have happened in those distant centuries, one that wiped out almost all of humanity. Maybe it wasn't just a fire that destroyed wooden temples, but something far more serious. A catastrophe that could have erased almost all traces of civilization, leaving only these cathedrals as silent witnesses. History can't explain how such grand buildings could have been built when the population was at a minimum. The math shows it's impossible. This means that either a different, far more advanced civilization existed back then, or we're dealing with the legacy of a disaster that was later explained away using the limited knowledge available at the time. What if the construction of these cathedrals wasn't the start of something new, but the restoration of existing structures that survived that catastrophe? The cathedrals, castles, and palaces that seem to us the work of medieval masters could be part of a much older architecture, restored by people who no longer had the knowledge to create such things from scratch. This opens up a completely new picture of the past, where a catastrophe and its aftermath play a key role. Maybe everything we know about the past is just an attempt to fit surviving elements into a convenient timeline. Cathedrals and other ancient buildings could be parts of a world that was destroyed, then rebuilt. We could be on the verge of discovering that our civilization isn't the first on this planet. The idea of a global catastrophe in the past opens up many new questions. What if this disaster wasn't just a local event, but a global reset of civilization, after which all knowledge was lost, leaving only ruins? Think about it. Cathedrals like Rheims could be not just the result of human work, but traces of a more ancient civilization that survived the disaster and was rebuilt on a smaller scale. Every cathedral and castle we see today might have been found and rebuilt, not built from scratch. The builders working in the 13th century might not have even known how to construct such buildings, only restoring them using the remaining elements of ancient architecture. This process of restoration could explain the lack of clear records about their construction, about the people who created them, and about the technology used. Those who undertook this work probably didn't have the full picture of what they were doing and were trying to recreate something that already existed. This explanation helps us understand many of the inconsistencies in history and logistics. Building these giant structures would have required knowledge and technology that simply couldn't have been lost in just a few centuries. But what if that knowledge was lost in a much more ancient time, and then, centuries later, people tried to restore what was gone? Originally, these cathedrals and other architectural masterpieces might not have been built in their own time, but were preserved and restored after a global catastrophe. We could be on the verge of a huge discovery that will change our understanding of history. Maybe our civilization isn't the first, and what we consider the beginning of history is just a part of it, lost in an instant of catastrophe. The math and logic we base our understanding of history on keep breaking the official version. If we accept that the world's population was as tiny as we're told when these cathedrals were built, then a logical question arises. Who did build these giant structures? Mathematical calculations show there were far too few people in the 13th century to erect objects like Rheims Cathedral. This casts doubt not only on the official timeline, but on all the explanations were offered. If there were only a few thousand people on the planet, how could they organize such projects? How could the logistics, the quarrying, the transport of blocks, the construction and supply of workers be managed with such a low population? These questions have no answers within traditional history. This forces us to look for other explanations. What if we're looking at these cathedrals not as achievements of their time, but as traces of a civilization destroyed in a global catastrophe? Cathedrals, castles, and other buildings we perceive as new constructions could have simply been restored or adapted by people who didn't have the necessary knowledge to build them from scratch. These people may have found existing ruins and tried to bring them back to life, not understanding the true scale and technology used before. This version helps explain why there are no clear records of these buildings' construction. The architectural knowledge that seems impossible for that time might have been lost during the catastrophe, then later restored based on what remained. So the official version, built on limited data, doesn't explain all the nuances, and we're left with the question: what existed before modern civilization arose? Now let's look at some deeper details that support our theory of a destroyed civilization. An important part of this hypothesis is the presence of strange, repeating symbols on ancient buildings worldwide. One such symbol is the griffin, a mythical creature depicted on the facades of many cathedrals and temples from Europe to Asia. This symbol appears too often to be random. It shows up on buildings separated by thousands of miles and centuries, raising the question: is there a hidden connection between these architectural objects? Griffins appear on various structures, from ancient temples to Gothic cathedrals, and their style is very similar. This could mean these buildings were once part of a single, larger culture, whose traces have been erased by time. A similar style in such distant places suggests the architecture of these buildings might share a common root. Maybe they were all created by one global civilization that used a unified architectural language. These symbols, like the griffins, could be a kind of signature of a lost civilization, leaving its mark on these buildings. The visual evidence of these similarities can't just be random. It tells us there weren't many separate peoples independently creating similar architectural solutions. On the contrary, it suggests the existence of a global culture that left this architectural language in the form of symbols on its buildings. Such symbols and recurring motifs become another piece of evidence that we're dealing with the legacy of a far more advanced civilization, whose achievements were lost or hidden. Maybe this confirms that the civilization which left these buildings was global and used common principles in its architecture. If we keep looking at the traces of this ancient civilization, it becomes more and more obvious that the cathedrals and other majestic buildings, like castles and palaces, were not built by 13th century people. Everything points to them being the legacy of a much older, vanished world that was found and restored. Why do these buildings, so technologically complex for their time, so often seem simply found and restored? The answer, perhaps, is that the people who came after the catastrophe didn't have the knowledge or technology to create such things from scratch, but found them in a ruined state and tried to restore them. Photographs and descriptions of old buildings from the late 19th century are a perfect example of this theory. These images show old cathedrals and temples already standing in a semi-ruined state. The surroundings look more like ruins than new construction. And although these buildings looked majestic, you can see they were part of an older civilization, destroyed by time or disaster. In the 19th century, people seemed to be just beginning to occupy these sites. And in their own activities, you see primitive transport, horse-drawn carts, simple clothes, which contrasts sharply with the level of construction of the cathedrals themselves. This contrast can't be a coincidence. In these photos, we see the remains of highly advanced architecture that people without the necessary knowledge tried to inhabit. We can only assume these buildings weren't built from scratch, but were simply found and adapted for the needs of a new era. This whole situation reminds us that history, as we know it, might be just a distorted version of what really happened. These buildings are silent witnesses to a lost civilization, whose achievements we are only beginning to uncover. So, all these cathedrals and castles, so mysterious and majestic, might be far more than just monuments of ancient architecture. Perhaps they represent the legacy of a lost civilization, restored by people who didn't understand the full depth of the knowledge that was gone. These buildings, with their incredible technological complexity and precision, cannot be products of their time. We see in them evidence of a civilization that existed before us and was destroyed by a catastrophe. And history itself, as we know it, may be just a fragment of what came before. If this hypothesis is true, it means we are not living in the first civilization on Earth. We are the heirs of those who came before us, who vanished and left only these silent monuments. Our world may have been rebuilt, and everything we know might just be an attempt to reconstruct what was destroyed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next investigations. There's still a lot we don't know, and many interesting discoveries lie ahead. Thanks for watching. See you next time.